You want to know how I destroyed my entire life over a Christmas dinner? Let me walk you through my masterclass in self-destruction, because apparently, I'm the kind of genius who can turn a family argument into a federal fraud case. My name is Owen Mitchell, and this is the story of how I learned that some people play chess while you're playing checkers. It started with that damn toolbox, Mason Rodriguez's precious red Craftsman set that sat in our garage like some kind of shrine to his dead father. Every time I walked past it, I could practically hear him thinking about how it represented his legacy or some bullshit like that. The man treated those tools like they were made of gold instead of steel that hadn't been used for anything more challenging than hanging picture frames in the last decade. Here's what you need to understand about Mason. The guy was 52, worked the forklift at the grain terminal, and somehow convinced himself that marrying my mother made him the patriarch of our family. For 8 years, I watched him play house with Mom, Nicole, acting like he belonged at the head of our table, sleeping in my father's spot, making decisions about our lives like he had earned the right. Don't get me wrong, I wasn't some ungrateful kid throwing tantrums. I was 28, working my ass off as an HVAC apprentice, trying to build something real. But Mason had this way of making everything about him, about his rules, his schedule, his version of what a family should look like. He'd renovated Mom's kitchen like he was marking territory, installed new cabinets and lighting, then acted like we should be grateful he'd improved his house. The thing that really got under my skin was how Mom let him. My real father, Dustin Brooks, had been absent for most of my childhood, chasing business opportunities and building what eventually became a successful equipment rental company. Yeah, he wasn't there for Little League games or school plays, but when he showed up this Christmas, he showed up with success, real money, real opportunities for me to finally get ahead. And Mason couldn't stand it. You could see it in his face every time Dustin talked about expanding the business, about bringing me in as a partner, about finally giving me the chance to be more than some apprentice making $12 an hour. Mason would get this tight little smile, like he was watching his territory get invaded. So, when Christmas Eve rolled around, I made a decision. It was time to establish some boundaries, time to remind everyone who was actually family and who was just along for the ride. The house smelled like ham and that artificial pine from Mom's favorite candles. Dustin had driven over from Cedar Falls, looking sharp in his wool coat and leather boots, the kind of outfit that cost more than Mason made in a week. I felt proud walking in with my father, knowing that for once, the most successful man in the room wasn't the guy who'd been playing house with my mother. We sat down for dinner, and everything felt normal at first. Mom had gone all out with the good china, the cloth napkins, the whole production she saved for holidays. Mason was doing his usual hosting routine, carving the ham with his father's knife, making small talk about the weather and work, acting like he was running the show. That's when I saw it, that look he gave Dustin when my father complimented the meal. That patronizing little nod, like Dustin was a guest who should be grateful for the invitation. Like my father needed Mason's permission to be at our table. And that's when I realized what needed to happen. "Hold up," I said when Mason reached for the carving knife, my hand finding the back of his chair. I could feel the whole table go quiet, forks pausing midair. "What are you doing?" Mason looked at me with that confused expression he'd perfected, playing innocent. "What do you mean?" I nodded toward Dustin, sitting there in his expensive coat, clearly the most important person at the table. "That seat belongs to my dad. Get out." You should have seen Mason's face, like he couldn't believe someone was finally calling him on his act. He started to laugh, this nervous little chuckle like maybe I was joking. "Owen, don't," he said, but his voice had that shaky quality it got when he was scared. I wasn't playing games. 8 years of watching this man pretend to be my father, 8 years of "yes, sir," and "thank you, Mason," and walking on eggshells around his feelings. 8 years of watching him work on that stupid toolbox in the garage, polishing his father's memory while ignoring that some of us had real fathers who were still alive. So I shoved him, 2 hands, firm pressure to his shoulders and chest. Not enough to hurt him, just enough to make a point, just enough to move him out of the way so the real man of the house could sit where he belonged. Mason went down harder than I expected. The chair scraped against the floor, his boot caught the edge of the rug, and suddenly he was on his back with gravy splashed across his shirt and the hardwood. Someone gasped. A fork hit a plate with a sharp ping. One of Mom's friends whispered something under her breath. But you know what? I wasn't sorry. Standing over him, watching him push himself up with one hand, I felt something I hadn't felt in years. Power, control, the satisfaction of finally putting things in their proper order. Mom grabbed napkins and started cleaning the floor, and I knew she understood. She knew Dustin belonged at the head of that table. She knew Mason had been playing dress-up as our father for too long. What I didn't know was that Mason was already 3 moves ahead of me. Mason stood up slow, like an old man feeling every year, and walked out without saying a word. Just left. No argument, no scene, no dramatic exit speech. The front door closed with this hollow thump that somehow made the whole house feel smaller. I should have seen that silence for what it was, but in that moment, watching Dustin slide into Mason's chair like he'd always belonged there, I felt like I'd finally won something. Finally stood up for my family the way a real son should. "Well," Dustin said, cutting into the ham with Mason's knife. "That was overdue." Mom kept cleaning the gravy stain, scrubbing at the hardwood like she could erase what had just happened. She wouldn't look at me, wouldn't look at Dustin, just kept working that spot with paper towels until Nicole's sister told her it was clean. The rest of dinner was awkward as hell, if I'm being honest. People picked at their food, made small talk about the weather and work, avoided mentioning the obvious. But I didn't care. For the first time in 8 years, the right man was sitting at the head of our table. For the first time in my adult life, my real father was where he belonged. After everyone left, Dustin pulled me aside in the garage. That's when he told me about the opportunity. His equipment rental business was expanding into HVAC installation, and he needed someone he could trust to run the technical side, someone with the training and the family connection to make it work. "I'm talking about real money, Owen," he said, hand on my shoulder the way fathers do in movies. "Enough to get you out of that apprenticeship dead end. Enough to buy a house, start building something that matters." Here's where I made my first real mistake. I started calculating. The HVAC equipment alone would run about 15 grand for a decent commercial setup. Dustin said he could cover most of it, but I'd need to secure some of the financing myself to show the banks I was committed, build my credit, prove I was serious about the partnership. "What about Mason's toolbox?" I asked. "Those are quality tools, craftsmen, mostly unused. Gotta be worth something." Dustin shrugged. "Mason's not family, son. Those tools belong to his father. Now they belong to you. That's how inheritance works in real families." It made sense. Mason had been playing house with our family for 8 years, but blood was blood. He'd married into our lives, but that didn't make him entitled to pass family tools down to some stepson who'd never even worked with his hands. 3 days after Christmas, I went to River Valley Credit Union with a business plan Dustin had helped me write. Professional stuff, profit projections, market analysis, the works. The loan officer, Sarah Henderson, seemed impressed with the presentation. But when she ran my credit, her expression changed. "Mr. Mitchell, your credit history is pretty thin," she said, scrolling through numbers on her screen. "We'd need a co-signer for this amount, someone with established credit and stable employment." That's where Mom came in. I didn't ask her to commit fraud. I want to be clear about that. What I asked her to do was help her son access opportunities that Mason's selfishness was blocking. I asked her to put my future ahead of her husband's ego. "Owen, I can't just sign Mason's name," she said when I explained the situation. We were sitting in her kitchen, the one Mason had renovated like he was marking territory. "You're not signing his name," I told her. "You're signing for the family. Mason married into this. That makes his credit part of our resources, just like his tools are part of our inheritance." She didn't like it. I could see the conflict in her face, the way she twisted her wedding ring around her finger. But I also saw something else. 8 years of watching Mason make decisions about our family without consulting anyone. 8 years of his quiet control, his assumed authority, his presumption that marriage made him the man of our house. "He'd just say no," she whispered, and I knew she was remembering every time Mason had played gatekeeper with their finances. Every time he'd made her ask permission to spend money she'd earned. Every time he'd acted like the responsible adult while treating her like a child. "Then we don't ask," I said. The signature wasn't perfect, but it was close enough. Mom had seen Mason sign things hundreds of times. She knew the rhythm of his handwriting, the way he looped his letters, the little flourish he added to the end of Rodriguez. And honestly, the bank wasn't looking that hard. As long as the name matched their records and the credit checked out, they were happy to process the loan. $16,500. Enough for a commercial HVAC setup. Enough to get Dustin's new division off the ground. Enough to finally give me the future I deserved. What I didn't expect was how fast it would all fall apart. The first payment came due in February. Dustin's business plan hit some snags, nothing serious. Just the kind of delays that happen when you're expanding into new markets. The rental side was solid, but the installation contracts were taking longer to materialize. Cash flow got tight. "Just cover it for now," Dustin said when I called him about the payment. "I'll have the money next month. This is just timing." But next month became the month after. And the month after became a collections notice. And collections notices, as I learned the hard way, don't just go to the borrower. They go to anyone whose name is on the loan, including Mason. I was at a job site in West Union, running refrigerant lines through a crawl space that smelled like dead mice and regret, when my phone started blowing up. First Mom, then some woman from the credit union, then Mom again. I couldn't answer because I was elbow deep in ductwork, but I could see the calls stacking up like a countdown timer. When I finally got out of that crawl space and listened to the voicemails, I knew I was fucked. Mom's voicemail was barely coherent. Something about the credit union calling, about Mason's credit being affected, about how she couldn't reach me and didn't know what to do. The panic in her voice made my stomach drop, but I told myself it was just a misunderstanding. Banks make mistakes all the time, right? The woman from River Valley Credit Union was more direct. Sarah Henderson, professional voice with an edge that told me this wasn't a courtesy call. "Mr. Mitchell, we need to discuss your loan payment status and some concerns that have been raised about your application." That's when I knew Mason had found out. I called Mom back first, but she was crying too hard to make sense. Something about Mason leaving early that morning, about how he'd gotten some kind of alert on his phone and looked like he'd seen a ghost. Something about him not answering his phone and her not knowing what to tell people. Then I tried calling Mason directly, straight to voicemail. I left a message trying to sound calm, professional, like this was just some banking confusion that adults could sort out. "Mason, it's Owen. There's some mix-up with the credit union. I'm sure we can get it sorted. Just call me back." No response. Here's what I should have done. Driven straight to his house, sat down like a man, and explained the situation. Told him about Dustin's business opportunity, about how this was temporary, about how I fully intended to handle all the payments myself. I should have treated him like family and trusted that he'd understand. Instead, I panicked and did something stupid. I called Dustin, told him the whole story about the loan, about Mason finding out, about how everything was falling apart. I expected him to step up, to handle the situation like the successful businessman he claimed to be. "Owen," he said, and his voice had this tired quality I'd never heard before. "This is more complicated than I thought. Let me make some calls." That was it. Let me make some calls. No reassurance, no immediate solution, no "don't worry, son, I'll handle this." Just a vague promise to make some calls. While I waited for Dustin to work his magic, I made another mistake. I went to Mom's house and moved Mason's toolbox out of the garage. Put it in my apartment where it belonged, where it should have been all along. If he was going to act like we'd stolen from him, we might as well take back what was rightfully ours. The toolbox was heavier than I expected. Those old craftsman tools were built to last, built when American manufacturing meant something. Each drawer was organized like a museum display. Wrenches arranged by size, sockets nested in perfect rows, screwdrivers lined up with military precision. Mason had obviously spent hours maintaining his father's collection, keeping everything clean and sorted and ready for work that never came. Looking at those tools, I felt something I didn't expect. Not guilt exactly, but something close to respect. This wasn't just equipment. This was a man's legacy, passed down from father to son, maintained with the kind of care that only comes from understanding what work really means. But respect doesn't pay bills, and legacy doesn't build futures. I had a business opportunity that could change my life, and Mason was treating it like theft. 2 days later, the bank called again. This time, it wasn't Sarah Henderson with her professional courtesy. This time, it was someone from the fraud department, asking if I could come in for a meeting, not requesting. Asking in the way, that means you don't have a choice. I wore my best shirt, the one Mom had bought me for job interviews. Tried to look responsible, like the kind of person who could handle a $16,000 loan. The bank felt different this time, like everyone was watching me, like they knew something I didn't. Sarah Henderson met me in a small conference room that smelled like cleaning supplies and fear. She wasn't alone. There was a man in a cheap suit taking notes and a woman with a badge who introduced herself as an investigator. "Mr. Mitchell," Sarah said, sliding a folder across the table. "We've reviewed your loan application, and there are some discrepancies we need to discuss." She opened the folder, and there it was. The signature page, blown up and printed in high resolution. Mason Rodriguez's name in Mom's handwriting, clear as day. Not perfect, but close enough that I'd thought we could get away with it. "Is this your signature?" the investigator asked, pointing to Mason's name. I stared at the paper, trying to think of an explanation that wouldn't implicate Mom. My mouth felt like sandpaper. "That's not my signature." "No," she agreed. "It's not. It's supposed to be your stepfather's signature, but Mr. Rodriguez filed a fraud complaint yesterday. He claims he never signed this document and never authorized this loan." The room went quiet except for the hum of fluorescent lights and the sound of my world collapsing. I looked at that signature, at Mom's careful attempt to recreate Mason's handwriting, and realized that we'd just handed him the perfect weapon. "Mr. Rodriguez provided us with samples of his actual signature," the investigator continued, sliding another sheet across the table. "The differences are significant. This appears to be a case of identity theft." Identity theft. The words hit me like a punch to the chest. Not a family misunderstanding, not a business dispute, not even fraud in the abstract sense. Identity theft was federal. Identity theft meant real prison time. "I want to cooperate," I said, my voice sounding strange in the small room. "I want to explain what happened." "That's good," the investigator said, clicking her pen. "Let's start with who had access to Mr. Rodriguez's personal information." And that's when I realized I had a choice. I could throw Mom under the bus and save myself, or I could take responsibility and hope Mason would show mercy to his wife. I chose wrong. "It was my idea," I said, the words coming out before I could stop them. "I asked my mother to sign the document. She didn't want to do it, but I convinced her." The investigator stopped writing. Sarah Henderson shifted in her chair. The man in the cheap suit looked up from his notes for the first time since we'd started. "You convinced your mother to forge your stepfather's signature?" the investigator asked, like she wanted to make sure she'd heard correctly. "I convinced her to help family," I said, doubling down on the stupidest decision of my life. "Mason's not really my father. Dustin is. Mason married my mother, but that doesn't make him entitled to control our future." The investigator made a note. "Mr. Mitchell, this isn't about family dynamics. This is about using someone's identity without permission to obtain credit. That's a federal crime." Federal crime. The words hung in the air like a death sentence. I started talking faster, trying to explain about Dustin's business opportunity, about how this was just temporary, about how I fully intended to make every payment, but the investigator wasn't interested in my entrepreneurial dreams or my family loyalty. "Where is the equipment now?" she asked. I told her the truth, sitting in a storage unit in Cedar Falls, still in the original packaging, waiting for Dustin's installation contracts to materialize. $16,000 worth of HVAC equipment that I couldn't even use because the business opportunity had evaporated faster than my common sense. "And your business partner, Dustin Brooks?" "He's working on new contracts," I said, but even I could hear how hollow it sounded. Dustin had stopped returning my calls 3 days ago. When I'd driven to his equipment rental office, the secretary said he was out of town on business, with the kind of tone that meant, "Don't come back." The meeting ended with me signing a statement acknowledging that I had asked Nicole to forge Mason's signature, and that I understood the seriousness of the situation. They gave me a case number and told me someone from the county attorney's office would be in touch. I drove home in a daze, my phone buzzing with missed calls from Mom. When I finally called her back, she was hysterical. "Owen, what did you tell them? Mason won't talk to me. He came home, packed a bag, and left. He said he's staying at his own house until this gets sorted out." "I told them it was my idea," I said. "I told them you didn't want to do it." "But I did do it," she cried. I signed his name. They're going to arrest me. That's when the full weight of what I'd done hit me. I destroyed my mother's marriage to protect myself, and it wasn't even going to work. The fraud was still fraud, regardless of whose idea it was. The signature was still forged, regardless of who did the forging. And Mason? Mason had played this perfectly. He'd let me confess, let me implicate Mom, let me dig the hole deeper with every word. He'd stayed quiet and let the system work exactly the way it was supposed to work. 3 weeks later, I got a call from a public defender named Janet Walsh. Thin voice, tired tone, the kind of overworked lawyer who handles cases like mine, between felony drug charges and domestic violence hearings. "Owen, I've reviewed your case," she said. "The county attorney is offering a plea deal. You plead guilty to identity theft, make full restitution, complete community service, and you avoid jail time. What about my mother?" "Your mother hired her own attorney. I can't discuss her case, but I understand she's cooperating fully with the investigation." Cooperating fully. That meant she was telling them everything. Every detail about how I'd convinced her, every conversation about the loan, every moment of doubt she'd had that she'd ignored because she wanted to help her son. I took the plea deal. Not because I thought I was guilty of a crime, but because I couldn't afford to fight it. The equipment went back to the supplier. Dustin's business opportunity disappeared along with Dustin himself. My HVAC apprenticeship ended when the background check came back with identity theft charges. The restitution was the worst part. $16,500 plus fees and interest. Money I didn't have, for equipment I'd never used, for a business partnership that had been nothing but promises from a man who'd abandoned his son twice. I had to sell everything, my truck, my tools, my furniture, everything I'd worked for in 10 years of adult life. Move back in with Mom, sleeping in my old room like a teenager, working part-time at a grocery store because no contractor would hire someone with theft charges. But the real punishment was watching what happened to my family. Mom and Mason's divorce went through 6 months later. Quiet, professional, no-fault dissolution of marriage. She kept the house, he kept his retirement account, and they divided 8 years of shared life like a business transaction. Mason moved back to his ranch house on the other side of town. Took his father's toolbox with him, of course. I saw him once at the grocery store where I was working, loading groceries into a cart with the careful efficiency of a man who'd learned to live alone again. He looked older, thinner, like the stress had worn him down. But there was something else in his expression when he saw me bagging groceries in my red vest and name tag. Not anger, not satisfaction, something like pity. That look hurt worse than the charges, worse than the restitution, worse than losing my apprenticeship. He pitied me. The man I'd tried to push out of my family felt sorry for the mess I'd made of my life. And you know what the real kick in the teeth was? I deserved it. Looking back now, 2 years later, I can see exactly where I went wrong. It wasn't the Christmas dinner confrontation. It wasn't even forging Mason's signature. It was thinking that family was something you could claim instead of something you had to earn. I spent 28 years believing that blood made me special, that being Dustin's son gave me rights that Mason's marriage couldn't match. I treated Mason like an intruder in our family instead of recognizing that he'd been building a family while my biological father was building a business. The math was simple, but I was too stupid and too proud to see it. Mason had been there for 8 years, daily, present, paying bills, fixing problems, showing up when showing up mattered. Dustin had been there for Christmas dinner and business opportunities. Mason earned his place at our table through a decade of small acts of service. I inherited mine through genetics and assumed that was enough. Here's what really happened that Christmas night. What I couldn't see through my anger and entitlement, Mason didn't just walk away from a family argument. He walked away from 8 years of investment in people who had just told him he didn't matter. And instead of fighting back in the moment, instead of making a scene or demanding respect, he did something smarter. He protected himself. The credit monitoring app wasn't revenge. It was responsibility. The fraud investigation wasn't payback. It was procedure. Mason didn't destroy our family out of spite. He just stopped protecting it from the consequences of our actions. I learned this the hard way, working my way through 2 years of community service and grocery store shifts, watching Mom rebuild her life alone. She never blamed me, not directly, but I could see it in the way she looked at her empty house, at the kitchen Mason had renovated, at the life she'd given up to protect a son who'd made her choose between her husband and her child. The worst part? I didn't even get to keep the toolbox. Mason's lawyer included it in the settlement agreement, listed right there between the car payments and the credit card debt. One vintage Craftsman tool set, serial numbers attached, to be returned to plaintiff within 30 days. I had to drive it back to his house myself. Court order. He wasn't there when I delivered it, just left instructions with a neighbor to put it in his garage. I spent 15 minutes unloading those tools, placing each wrench and socket back in its designated spot, understanding for the first time what it meant to maintain something that belonged to someone else. Those tools weren't just equipment. They were a relationship between a father and son that had lasted beyond death, maintained by a man who understood what inheritance really means. It's not about blood. It's not about who deserves what. It's about who shows up to do the work. I never saw Dustin again after the plea hearing. His equipment rental business is still running, apparently successful. But he's never called to check on how I'm doing. With the restitution payments, never offered to help cover the legal fees, never acknowledged that his business opportunity cost me everything I'd worked for. But, you know what? I get it now. Dustin didn't owe me anything just because we shared DNA. I was the one who assumed that biology created obligation, that being someone's son automatically made me their responsibility. Mason never made that assumption. He married my mother and took on her baggage, including a hostile stepson who resented his presence. He could have demanded respect, could have used his financial stability to force compliance, could have given Mom an ultimatum about her ungrateful kid. Instead, he just kept showing up, kept paying bills, kept fixing things, kept trying to build something that included all of us, right up until we made it clear that we didn't want to be included. The grocery store job led to an assistant manager position, which led to a district supervisor role. I'm making decent money. Now, nothing spectacular, but honest work that doesn't require someone else's credit or promises about future opportunities. I've got an apartment, a reliable car, and a credit score that's slowly climbing back toward respectability. Mom and I have dinner once a week, usually Sundays, at a diner near her house. We don't talk about Mason much, but sometimes she mentions seeing him at the grocery store or the credit union, looking healthy, looking settled in his life without us. She doesn't sound bitter when she says it. She sounds like a woman who understands that some mistakes can't be undone, only lived with. I think about that Christmas dinner a lot. About the moment I put my hands on Mason's shoulders and shoved him out of his chair, thinking I was defending my family's honor. I was actually defending an idea of family that existed only in my head, a fantasy where blood mattered more than commitment, where showing up once was worth more than showing up every day. Mason was never the intruder in our family. I was. He built something real with my mother, and I tore it down because I couldn't stand that someone else's work was more valuable than my birthright. The real tragedy isn't that I lost my HVAC career, or had to pay restitution, or ended up bagging groceries for 2 years. The real tragedy is that I had a stepfather who would have taught me what it meant to be a man, and I was too busy defending my right to be his son to learn from his example. Sometimes the person you're fighting isn't your enemy. Sometimes they're the father you needed, and you're just too young and stupid and proud to see it. By the time you figure that out, you've already lost the thing you were fighting to protect.